My name is Ryan Pankau. I'm a horticulture educator in Champaign-Urbana is where my office is, and my background is as an arborist and a forester. So today we're talking about just one of my favorite topics of all time, trees. So trees and woody plants are my first love in horticulture, and so I'm excited to talk to you about that today. Here's kind of an outline of what we'll talk about. So we're going to start with some basics of tree biology and how trees grow. We'll look at trees on a larger scale all the way down to the cellular scale to kind of talk about tree defenses and how trees defend themselves when an injury occurs. And then finally, at the end of the talk today, we'll talk about how all of this relates to pruning cuts. So I'll give you guys some great take-home messages as the next time you look to make a pruning cut. I hope you'll think about it differently after today's presentation. So this slide gives percentages of the relative biomass a tree has, so the mass of these different tree parts, and it's always interesting for me to look at this breakdown. And if we look at what sticks out the most here, the trunk takes about 60% of that biomass in a tree. So that's the large structural tissue that holds that plant up. And so trees do a lot of things to defend against decay and other pathogens entering that trunk. So we're gonna look at that in detail today. So first, let's talk about the annual budget for a tree's energy use. So this is always explained to me in the world of arboriculture as kind of like a bank. So in the springtime, trees are withdrawing energy from that bank account to leaf out and to open up buds and to leaf out and to start growth for the year. During the summer, they're making a deposit into that bank account as that leaf material they made has photosynthesized throughout the year and created energy that can be stored. And in fall, there's actually a deposit and a withdrawal. So trees continue to photosynthesize in the fall, and they're depositing more energy, but at the point where they begin to drop their leaves, that's a time of high energy expenditure, so they're actually withdrawing some of that. And then over the winter time is savings, because deciduous trees are in dormancy, and they save energy during that time in general. So how this plays into tree wounding and all the things that we're going to talk about today is if a tree is actually at a deficit in this budget, if it's withdrawing more energy than it can produce, that will lower tree health and can ultimately lead to the death of a tree. So all of the things that we do to interact with these large perennial woody plants in the landscape can affect this energy budget, and healing from wounds takes a lot of energy out of this budget. So especially when we'll talk about at the end of the talk, when we make a pruning cut, it's important that we make a correct cut so we're not taking too much out of this budget and putting our tree into debt, essentially. So this is a basic diagram of some tree biology. So this is a cross-section of a tree. So if you were to cut a little cookie out of the trunk of a tree, or cut off a trunk and look down on that, this is the cross-sectional view. So we can see on here just some basic parts of the tree. The xylem, which is non-living tissue that transports nutrients, like soil nutrients, like nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus up the trunk along with water. Phloem then is located a little further towards the outside of the tree, and that's actually living tissue that transports sugars within the tree. So it transports energy within the tree to the site that it needs to be used at. The cambium is a really vital layer to all of this that's also living but produces the xylem and the phloem. And finally, heartwood shown in this picture as the center of the tree, which is non-living xylem cells that actually are the structure that hold up that tree. So the middle part of a tree is non-living cells that just kind of hold up the tree and provide structure. Here's another picture of a cross-section of a tree, and I love this is actually a twig. I love these slides like this because they're all the cells have been dyed in these slides, and really makes an interesting look at this cross-section where you can see some of these different parts we were just talking about. And so as we continue into this talk, I want to look at, I'm going to present to you a model that I made of kind of this cellular view, and we'll discuss what's going on in these different parts of the tree. So first, let's talk about primary growth in woody plants. And the primary growth in a woody plant that we see on the outside of the plant actually starts in the tips. And that's the growing point of a tree, is the tips or the apical bud. So that bud imposes apical dominance down the rest of the plant. It exudes a growth hormone called auxin, which inhibits the growth of some of the lateral limbs and says, hey, I'm the apical bud, I'm here, I'm growing, so others don't need to grow as tall as me. So this growth occurs in twigs and roots and buds. This is the type of growth that we typically see and notice on trees very readily. Whereas secondary growth is actually growth that happens in the inner portion of the tree, growth from the cambium, which provides that, enlarges the trunk over time and provides that strength that we need. Reaction wood is another type of secondary growth. And this is wood that's formed in the trunk when the cambium's out of alignment a little bit. When a tree has to put a little bit more wood on one side to counterbalance its weight, that's what we call reaction wood. Another good example of that is when there's a wound or a lightning strike on a tree trunk, you see reaction wood kind of form around that as a reaction to that wound. So it actually differs among conifers and deciduous trees. In deciduous trees, they would put on, in the form of reaction wood, theirs is called tension wood, which typically occurs on the upper part of stems and is a type of reaction wood that is formed under tension, whereas conifers put on compression wood that's usually on the lower parts of the stems and is formed in that fashion in a conifer tree. So now let's look at, here's kind of my secondary growth model, my homemade model of how a tree grows, and down to the cellular level, where you can see the center of the tree is kind of towards the top of the slide. Down here at the bottom of the slide, this is kind of the bark, or the outer part of the tree. So we're looking at a little tiny slice of the tree that's kind of a cross-sectional view. So if we cut a slice out almost like a little piece of pie, that's what we're looking at. So you can see in red there are cells that I've drawn to kind of depict the cambium layer. So that's, again, the thin layer of cells that to the inner part of the tree, towards the center, in this area, grows the xylem. In the outer part of the tree grows the phloem. Moving through the rest of this secondary growth model, the periderm, or the bark, is everything outside of that cambium layer, and it's actually divided into inner bark and outer bark. But there certainly is a lot going on there. This is the growing, living, just a lot of activity in the tree happens right there. So in the next few slides, let's take a few looks at some of the other details of what's going on there. So the cork cambium is actually an outer layer of meristematic tissue. So that meristematic tissue is actively growing tissue that's able to grow and develop, that gives rise to the cork on the outer layer of the tree. So what's the cork? We'll talk about that in a few slides, but that's the bark, or the material that we see on the outside of the tree that we commonly refer to and think of as bark. So advancing to the next slide here, the phloem, or the cork, which is what we know as the bark, develops on the outside of that cork cambium layer, and it's definitely infused with a material called suberin, which is a waxy, impermeable substance that's put into the cell walls of the cells in the phloem, and that's what repels, traps moisture inside the tree, protects the tree from a lot of things on the outside. And so that's an important material. It's part of those cell walls. It's part of that protective layer, which we think of as bark, but commonly is referred to as cork. The phloderm is a layer of tissue produced right inside the cork cambium, and it has what's called active parenchyma tissue. So parenchyma cells are actually the living functional cells of the tree. So they're in a lot of other places, but they are produced directly to the inside of that cork cambium layer. And they can be used for a lot of things. Photosynthesis is one of those things that they can do. They can react in a defensive nature and provide defense from disease and other things. And they can even divide and create new cells. And we'll look at kind of how all that would happen later on in this presentation. But just interesting to know that there's very active living cells just right inside that cork cambium and right on the outer layer of the trunk there. So any wound to the bark of a trunk, to the bark can really quickly get into some of these living cells and cause problems for the tree. So trees have to be ready to react and have some type of defense. So the phloem is another major part of this that forms right outside the cambium layer and is responsible for conducting the sugars or the energy down, mostly down the tree, and taking them to the site of utilization. So it's taking sugar that is produced in the leaves and taking it to the cells within the tree that actually need to use that sugar for some of their life processes. So very important function there. The sieve tube elements, kind of shown in green here, are those main transportation cells within the phloem. They are actually living cells. So they're alive, but they don't actually have a nucleus where they can react to other signs in the plant, but they instead have companion cells that are there with them that do have a nucleus and are able to react to changes in the plant and adjust what those sieve tube elements are doing. So back to the cambium here as we're moving in towards the center of the tree. Again, the cambium is what produces that, the radial growth of the tree, of the phloem to the outside, the xylem to the inside. And here you can see the xylem kind of in blue and the phloem in orange. So those are both formed again from the cambium. So that's just that really important layer of growth there, right towards the outer edge of the tree. The xylem represents the annual growth increments or rings that we would see in a tree. So you can see kind of that one of those annual growth rings or increments kind of illuminated there in blue. And so that's when we count the growth rings on a tree, we're actually counting those increments of xylem that are put on each year. Within the xylem, the conductive cells are actually the vessel elements. So they conduct nutrients and water up the stem to the leaves and the other areas of the plant that need it. But these are actually non-living cells. At maturity, they're actually dead cells, and they are highly lignified. And what does that mean? They're infused with lignin, which is actually a substance that's deposited in the cell walls that makes them rigid and woody and provides that, a lot of that structure that we need out of the trunk and those inner parts of the trunk. So here's kind of a microscopic view of those elements, and I love this picture. On the left, it's again one of those. It's again one of these pictures on the cellular level of a cross section where all these cells have been dyed, so we can kind of see those on a slide. And here you can see these large vessel elements that are used for conducting water and nutrients up and down the plant. To the right is kind of a 3D model of those, so you can really see these kind of cavernous holes that conduct material up the plant, and it really helps to kind of picture those as almost like tubes that or pipes that are a conduit up the plant for water. So there's a difference in those types of cells in deciduous trees and conifers. In deciduous trees, we call them vessel elements. That we've just kind of discussed those and looked at some pictures of those, and they have perforated ends, so what we would call like an end plate, which actually regulates the movement of material through there, whereas in conifers, they're called tracheids, and they're less complex. They don't have end plates, and they work just a little bit differently. And I believe on the next slide here, we have kind of a picture of the two of those. So at the left, you can see a tracheid, which has what we refer to as pits that kind of allow the water to conduct through them, kind of in more of a network or a system. Whereas if you look at the vessel element on the right, I view those more like pipes or tubes. They do have some interconnectedness, but are more of a regular, not as much of a network, are a little more evolved than what we see in conifers. So provide a different method for uptake of water through the plant, where they also have pits similar to the tracheids, but they also have what's called perforations on those end plates that allow the water to move upward through these structures. Fibers are what we think of as wood fiber. They are highly lignified, so really, really stiff cells that are non-living and provide mechanical support for the tree. So they support that heavy trunk, and all the branches and limbs and leaves and everything else of the tree are supported primarily by these fibers. And actually sapwood fibers, so fibers that are outside the cambium layer, are actually alive at maturity and used for storage at times of energy within the tree. So they do have another function before they become the heartwood, that's the inner part of the tree. They can actually store some energy for use. So rays are actually radioparenchyma cells. So they're living cells that are able to react to things, and they form this radial lines going outward into the tree. So they actually allow transport of sugars and other materials outward into the trunk as well as inward. They can kind of be thought of as somewhat of a network of things in there, of interconnected cells that actually are conducting, along with the phloem, are conducting those sugars that the plant needs really to wherever they need to go. So it's based on the need of the cells around them as to what direction that sugar might be transported through these. And here's that same picture. It's kind of a microscopic view of a cross-section of cells. You can see here's our vessel elements that we looked at before, but here are those neat little lines of ray cells going through here. So what this kind of serves to show is that my model that I've drawn is really a simplified version of something very complex and irregular. So, the model that we're looking at is kind of symmetrically drawn and meant to think about it and educate you folks on it, but it's not that simple. In nature, it is actually just a complex system of all of this. So finally, the symplast is the living portion of the tree. So that's a lot of the different elements that we just discussed. It's kind of it's the network of living cells within that tree. It's 3D and web-like. It stores starch. It consists of all these things we've talked about, of the cork cambium and the sieve tubes within it, within the phloem, the cambium, the rays we just discussed. So there's this network you see there in red of all those living cells within the tree that are kind of this referred to collectively as the symplast. So now let's talk about tree wounds, and they can happen for a variety of reasons. In both of these cases here, it was a limb that broke out of a tree, but there's other ways they can happen. We've probably all seen examples like the injury to the trunk on this maple tree, probably from a mower. But during a tree's life, they are exposed to countless wounds. And all of those wounds increase their exposure to pathogens and parasites. And it's just kind of that opening introduction for a parasite to move into the tree or a pathogen and start the process of decay and hurt the tree. So throughout their lives, trees have to continually react and change and do things to stop the introduction of some of these pathogens. So how do trees protect themselves? Well, they are highly compartmentalized plants. That's the big word of the day, is compartmentalization, and we're going to look at exactly how that happens in some of the coming slides. But really, unlike humans, trees cannot regenerate cells. Instead, they grow new cells around an injured area and just envelop the old cells and try to wall off or trap any pathogens that may have entered or any decay that has started. So so wounded tissue really is not replaced or repaired. Instead, it is compartmentalized. It's grown around and walled off, and a tree tries to just trap it in one place and confine its movement. So within a tree, natural compartments are formed, and here you can kind of see in orange like one of those natural compartments. And it's really defined, and in my little model here, it's perfectly defined as a square, where as we looked at in some of those microscopic views, it wouldn't probably be quite this perfect in nature. So you can see that all of those compartments are divided off by living tissue at their borders. So this is kind of, I've lit up the symplast of the tree again. So all these living cells that are red, so they already are kind of walling off those individual compartments there. So probably the biggest theory in arboriculture, or our current understanding is explained by the CODIT model, which was developed by Dr. Alex Shigo back in the 70s, and CODIT stands for Compartmentalization of Decay in Trees. Here you can see a picture of the cover of Dr. Shigo's, the main book that he has on CODIT, and I really encourage, if this type of stuff interests you, read Dr. Shigo's book. It is super interesting. He did spent a lot of time taking careful cuts through logs to look at all these different aspects of how trees compartmentalize decay. And there's just really great photos, really great description, and really he's kind of the founding father of all this theory in arboriculture, and very interesting read. But based on the CODIT model, there's actually 4 different walls or barrier zones within trees that inhibit the movement of rot. So we're going to look at these in detail in some of the slides coming up and kind of try and relate them to my model. But here it's kind of outlined or described where wall 1 kind of inhibits vertical movement up and down the trunk. So wall 1 would inhibit movement of rot kind of up and down the trunk based off of where this wound was. It would stop this movement upward or downward. Whereas wall 2 inhibits some of the inward movement from the wound inward towards the trunk. It is not the weakest, but the second weakest, where wall 1 is actually the weakest wall when we discuss in terms of strength for repelling rot and decay. That's what I mean by the weakest. So wall 1 is the least able to repel the pathogens that would come in and start to rot and decay the tree. Wall 2 would be the second weakest. Wall 3 inhibits the radial movement. So remember the ray cells we looked at that are kind of oriented radially through the tree. It inhibits movement that direction along those lines. So that's actually the strongest at the time of wounding, but once the wound happens, immediately the tree starts to form wall 4, which is called a barrier zone, and that inhibits the movement into new growth. So as that tree starts to grow around this wound, starts to grow around and encase this wound with new growth right here and right here, that barrier zone stops the movement of rot into the new growth. So it's the strongest of all 4 of the walls. And here's just another kind of example from one of Shigo's books where it shows on a real chunk of tree here some of those different walls, where you can see from this, here's a large wound on the side of the trunk. Here's wall 1 stopping that rot coming downward. Here's wall 2 that kind of stops that growth into the next ring, into the inner, the rings inside of that growth. So it stops it along what used to be a cambium, where it used to be a cambium layer. You can see wall 3 here that kind of stops that growth along a ray cell. And then finally wall 4 is this barrier level layer between this new growth right out here that happened after the wound and the old discolored growth inward in the tree. So let's go back to my model and kind of look at an example of how a tree wound might happen and how cells in the tree react. So let's imagine that where this brown arrow is, this tree just had a big chunk bit out of it, or scratched out of it by a lawnmower, or however that might have happened. So we're missing cells. That's been kind of wounded and ripped open right there. So right away we can see with the red right here that living tissue is encompassing the compartments that have been impacted. So there's a little bit of tree. This compartment was impacted as it was breached right there, so there's living cells surrounding it. Here's a little bit of a compartment. Here's a little bit of the same compartment that was wounded when this wound happened. And so all of this is encased by living cells that can actually react and do something. So the first thing that happens when this wound initially breaches the trunk and it hits the cambium is the cambium starts to form a barrier zone. So along its inner edge right here, the cambium has started to form a barrier zone. You see it's went a little bit into the ray cells here, along here, and it actually extends out past where the actual wound was. That whole cambium is stimulated to create this barrier zone. So what happens in the barrier zone is a lot of those cells are very rich in suberin. Remember we talked about that earlier. It's waxy, it's impermeable, there's a little less lignin in some of these cells and fewer conductive elements. So as that cambium starts to change and react and grow differently, there's fewer conductive cells in there that can allow movement up and down and throughout the tree. So right away changes happen in the cambium. And this is an example of a tree cookie, or a cross-section actually cut out of a tree, and you can really see a good example of that, initial wounds start to happen, and that I like this example of kind of what's happened in the cambium there, where it started to really react and change its growth to repel the rot coming inward. So over time, this tree's actually been able to grow around this wound that happened right here. So it's grown around and actually what we would consider sealed in that wound. So trees don't heal, they seal is a common term you'll hear arborists use, and so that wound has been sealed over by the tree. So right after as this wound has happened, again we have some additional growth on the cambium, but also we have wall 1 beginning to develop right away in that compartment, and that's these red cells right here are vessel cells that are being plugged. So again, remember that's going up and down the tree. So we're looking downward on the tree, so that this cell goes up and down from the view that we're seeing, and it's already started to plug itself. But that's actually the weakest wall. So remember, and some of what I always think helps kind of relate in my mind, this being the weakest wall, is the fact that a lot of trees have a completely hollowed out trunk and they're still healthy and fine and living, and that's because this wall 1 is the weakest, and that rot has spread rapidly upward throughout the trunk. But because some of the other walls that limit that lateral movement, or that movement in and out on the trunk, have resisted that decay and rot, the tree's able to stay living and still have conductive tissue in the cambium. In the cambium and phloem and xylem, this conductive tissue is still able to exist, even though the tree is pretty hollow. Wall 2 is the second weakest wall, and it forms right along this old layer of cambium. So there's parenchyma cells right there that are active and alive and able to start to form a barrier right there. And so they start to form this next barrier that kind of limits inward development of rot and stops it. Wall 3 now, again, is formed along the rays, so it actually blocks some of that lateral movement and tries to further kind of confine everything to this one little compartment and wall that off, essentially. And wall 4, again, is the barrier zone that started initially with this reaction in the cambium, but continues further growth to start to develop this new wood around here that eventually is going to encase this entire bit of wound or potential rot right there. So that's the strongest wall in the CODIT model. That's the barrier zone between the new wood, the wound wood that's formed on the outside, and the actual rot or decay that's on the inside. So here's just another view, kind of like that 3D model we looked at a few slides ago. And here's an example of a wound that's happened. Here's a cross section of that trunk looking downward that's taken from right here. And we can see a lot of the different walls. There's wall 3 along the rays that's blocked it off. Here's where wall 4 is developed to stop any movement into this newer growth. As we move further up the tree, we can see more and more of that rot is confined, but there's a considerable amount of movement up and down the trunk as opposed to inward. This inward movement has really been stopped or blocked by formation of the third wall. So that's kind of how rot moves throughout a tree and in relation to some of those walls. So what about pruning? How does pruning relate to this entire system? Well, each pruning cut is essentially a wound, and if we can make those pruning cuts correctly, we can assist the tree in this process of sealing over the wounds as opposed to causing a bigger, worse wound for the tree. So here's a couple figures right out of the Master Gardener training manual. And when we look at how to make a proper pruning cut, one of the things that we need to do is first identify the branch collar. So the branch collar is this area of growth right here. And you can, on some limbs you can see it really well, like in this picture. On some limbs you can't see it all that well, and it's an area, I kind of describe it as some kind of rumply looking bark right there, but it's an area of interwoven fibers between the branch tissue and the trunk tissue that kind of interweave and lock right there and provide some of the stability that that branch needs to stay on the tree and to not bend or break under all the pressure of the weight on its tips from leaves and other things. So as the trunk grows and the limb grow, those fibers interlock right there, and different trees have different characteristics of how well or how poorly those fibers interlock. But the point is, there's this area of interlocking fibers that the last thing that we would want to do is prune this off. So you can see right here where this diagram shows a correctly made pruning cut. It's just right outside of that branch collar where this piece of branch was removed and cut off right there, but we've left this intact. And the reason being, there's actually actively growing cells right within that branch collar that are what's going to react and grow callus tissue or new wood over the wound and seal it over. If we had a cut like this where the stub was left, that's going to actually delay this process of sealing over, because all of this callus tissue would have to grow all the way out and around and encase this stub before it could block all entry from rot on this particular tree. So now here's an example of a couple real life pruning cuts that were already made. And on the left, on this red maple, that's actually a pretty good pruning cut. You can see this reaction wood or this wound wood forming right here around the cut. And eventually, as that grows over the years, it's going to grow all the way into the center and entirely seal over that. On the second picture at the right here, you can see a stub was left on this tulip poplar. Here's a good amount of wound wood starting to form there that's going to try and seal over this, but it's going to have to grow all the way out and around this stub and encase it, or the stub is going to have to rot to a point that it would fall off the tree, and then this could grow over that rotten area. But at the point that this stub has rotted all the way off, there's quite a bit of rot that's spread, again, up and down this limb back into the tree. So if this cut had just been made right along here, we wouldn't have that stub kind of inhibiting the growth of the wound wood. One way that you can, as an arborist, I always go back and check my work, is you can look at a past pruning cut, and this, however, if this little donut shape of wound wood, I always refer to this as the donut shape, is symmetrical, then that cut was made right at the right spot, because all the callus tissue or all the branch collar tissue was left on the tree, none was cut off, and so it was able to react and grow symmetrically. We can see on this cut, I actually made this cut. This is on my father-in-law's red maple tree, but I cut a little too close right up here. You can see there's not as much wound wood formation right there, whereas the rest of it is just about symmetrical. So I probably got a little too close in there and cut a little bit of the branch collar tissue off. Even as an experienced arborist, making this cut right here is not as simple as the diagram shows. And a lot of times this branch collar tissue is not as visible, and there's times that you're really just trying to make your best judgment for where you can line up that cut. It probably takes practice and repetitive cuts over time to get good at that and be able to do it on a regular basis correctly each time you make that cut. So as you start to practice and make some of these cuts, I do have one tip called the 3-cut method that can help you alleviate bark stripping. So in this example, we have a little diagram here that kind of shows the 3-cut method, where the first cut that you would make is just on the bottom side of the limb. And what that does is alleviates the tension here on these wood fibers, where the second cut, one thing I don't like about this figure is that you would need to cut all the way through for the second cut. So on the second cut, we would cut all the way through, and as you cut down onto this limb and it starts to bend down under the pressure, right here you can actually get some peeling back down the trunk. So that's why we do this first cut, is to relieve some of that tension, to sever those fibers, so when you make this second cut, the furthest the bark can strip is back to there. And then finally, after the second cut, you would have this little bit of a stub here. You would make the final cut right here at the branch collar, which is number 3. So what happens if you don't make that cut correctly? Here's a good example of a big limb that's stripped all the way down the trunk. The 3-cut method was not used here in this example. And you can see it actually took a chunk of wood fiber all the way down the tree off as it peeled down. This is a Siberian elm. They're pretty notorious for this kind of peeling. Here's another example of a cut on a tulip poplar, and this is an old wound where there's a little bit of wound wood that's kind of formed around here, but you can see there is a little bit of bark stripping right there. So that little bit of strip right there pulled off a bunch of the branch collar tissue right here, and where if that cut had been made in the correct location, we would have a nice little edge to our donut right here and some wound wood forming. But instead, the tree has to actually expend a lot of energy to reform that wound wood, or to start to initiate growth down here to form new wood and encase this area of potential rot. So really important to follow this 3-cut method on a larger limb. And I've even found certain trees, as you start to prune them, even on smaller limbs, can have a tendency to strip like this as you start to cut the limb off and the weight comes down and pulls the fibers. So even on very small limbs, going back to this kind of model of the three method cut, a lot of times I definitely do this undercut to relieve some of the tension and cut through. And I know it makes 3 cuts on each pruning cut, but to stop this kind of thing from happening is really important. And if you think of all the energy the tree has to invest to change its growth pattern and develop new wood in that area, it's really significant. So each one of those pruning cuts we can make right at the branch collar is really important. So here's pictures of a couple more pruning cuts. Again, here's what I view as kind of a pretty good one. I maybe got a little close up there, but a lot of times you'll see this kind of a reaction or wound wood form. Here's what I think is a pretty good cut made on a red oak. You can see a lot of this branch collar tissue was left, and this wound looks to be made, or this cut looks to be made right about at the edge of where the branch collar tissue is. This is another cut on an oak tree, and you can see somebody probably missed the exact target here of where we should cut at. The donut is a lot thicker out here. This wound wood is a lot thicker, where in here it's taken a little more time for that to develop. I think there's probably a little bit of an influence from this crack or defect. I think this is a large branch union right here, and there's maybe kind of a little bit of a crack there. So maybe the tree's struggling to put some growth on there, but this again is kind of a good measure of how well you left the branch collar intact, and how much you may have gotten off in one spot or another. And finally, this is a trunk of a white oak tree down in the Shawnee National Forest that I thought was just really interesting. This tree's never really been pruned. It's had limbs break off in storms, and so each one of these big lumps you see is an old branch stub that's just been encased by wound wood. So it just goes to show that a tree can resist rot for a long time and actually can develop tissue that grows all the way around each one of these old stubs. But think of the amount of the tree budget that was used each year to put on this additional growth, that if somebody came along and pruned some of these stubs off like this one, that tree could just wound over nice and evenly right there or can seal over nice and easily right on the original wound. With that, I'll take any questions you guys have, and feel free to type into the chat box. I've got that pulled up on my screen, or you're welcome to just speak up if you can. And so my contact information is listed here. If you folks do have additional questions later, or would like to discuss some issues with the tree wound, I'm always happy to talk. Feel free to email me or give me a call. Happy to discuss things. Thank you so much for joining us today for the University of Illinois Extension 4 Seasons Gardening webinar on compartmentalization and natural defense mechanisms in trees. If you're interested in viewing a recording of this webinar or any past webinars, they're all accessible on our YouTube channel, which you can see here. Also, we have a survey related to today's webinar. So if you'd like to access the survey and provide us with some feedback, we'd love to hear from you, and that's all accessible either through the QR code you see here or the short URL at the bottom of the slide. So thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you on our next 4 Seasons Gardening webinar.